I'll do this one a little bit shorter, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So I didn't really go over much, so I'll recap what I just said here for the video. In all we did was jump over to the camera setting, okay, and we started explaining everything here. So the presets are good enough for us. We're just going to go to bright exterior. It's going to set our exposure so enough light gets into the camera just fine. Don't worry about film back, but the output resolution is important. Make sure that you toggle on the heads up display. That's through this button right there. And the important thing to note here is that whether it's viewport, which is the viewport that you see on screen, or if you switch it over to a different resolution, it should show you the extents of the frame. So anything that's darkened on the outside of this orange line is not going to render. If you put that on and it shows up with a red frame or a red tag at the top and bottom, and you don't see the orange box, that means that your frame is most likely larger than the view that you see. And so you need to kind of zoom in a little bit to get the right scene until we figure out how to scale it down, those weird things. So anyway, we can, here in focus, there's a few ways that you can change how something is going to focus in your scene. One of the easiest ways, and again, I'm trying to focus on easy things that you can do, is to grab this thing right here, autofocus to objects, and you just pick something that's roughly in the middle of your model, like that, and then hit enter. And it autofocuses everything to that geometry, and then you can start playing with like your lens to make things in the foreground fade and background fade, if you're going to get there. But for us, we're not going to worry about that in Maxwell. Okay, so that generally covers the camera settings. I don't really want you to mess with too much else outside of that unless you know what you're doing. So these two tabs right here are location and time and environment. So location and time is nothing but the information that drives the environment, which means it's really just the location of the sun and our geographical location. So we can change this, and we can find something like Los Angeles or San Francisco, wherever you want to place us. Let's see, let's go up. Wait, where am I? Oh, I'm like way beyond L. There we go, Los Angeles. Sure. Is Pomona on there? No, that was Pomona, Colorado, wasn't it? Anyway, so we're going to take Los Angeles here, and it gives us the latitude and longitude, and then you can change the day and time of the year. So what you need to be aware of is when you change this setting to a shade, let's see, a rendered viewport. Sorry, I switched that out. Okay, so you change this to a rendered viewport, and then you click on this little button right here, Show Sun in Viewport. Click that on, and it's going to show you the actual time of day as you slide around the time of day here. So you can set where the sun is going to be hitting your building. And I think, you know, for my purposes, I want to do something that's kind of dramatic. So I'll go with a high sun angle. August is good. I can go back to July, I guess. Or let's go to the solstice, June 21st. Okay, high sun angle and kind of in the middle of the day-ish. Yeah, so that's going to get me some really interesting shadows on my building. Make sense? Okay. So outside of that, we have environment. And environment is where things get really intense. I'm not going to go through all of the settings, but one thing that you could try to play around with is constant dome is it's kind of like a base default. It's just going to be like this constant gradient environment that goes around the entire space. If you switch it over to physical sky, that's where you can play around with the sun settings a little bit. But if you're going to play around with it, I would suggest only really mess with intensity, turbidity, You could play with temperature a little bit, but don't mess around with it very much. Okay, turbidity is going to be like the amount of particulate that's in the air, so like how hazy it is. So anyway, so you leave that on and make sure that you check on use sun. Okay, that's going to be an important checkbox. All right, so last but not least, we have the output settings here. So you can go through and name your file ahead of time and establish a folder to save all of your drafts in and all that other stuff. I generally don't do that. I just let it go to the default folder. And then when I get into the Maxwell Studio thing, user interface, I just save as and put it where I want to put it. Because I don't necessarily want all my drafts. But that's up to you. You can auto file name if you want. But here's something that's very important. I need you guys to understand this about Maxwell. Maxwell is like a ray trace renderer. So theoretically, Maxwell could render forever and never, ever, 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 ever be done. It's just going to get better and better and better the more time it has to run. So time and SL means time limit for how many minutes it'll run for. And SL is for the sampling limit. So a sample is essentially like a pass. Like for those of you who are used to V-Ray, for instance, where you can actually see the little boxes going through and rendering it, that's kind of like a sampling level because it starts to render a pass, and then it goes through and it does another pass and does it a little more accurately, and then it does another one. So this will run for 9,999 minutes or 25 sampling levels. Okay, 25 is actually, if you're going for a pretty high render quality, that's a good amount to go for, but it's going to run for a long time. I generally, for our class, will just cut off our render times at like 15 minutes or something like that for a draft render. And then if it's going to be a full quality render, I don't need you guys to be rendering these things out for any longer than an hour or 2 hours maybe. Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of why we talk about Lumion. But the other settings, and this is very, very important, you guys. Quality and multi-light. These two are critical. Quality has a draft quality and a production quality. You might think that it's valuable for you to use draft quality. I think that you should almost never use draft quality because what multi-light allows you to do is change your lighting levels after the rendering, which is hugely valuable. But you can't use it if you do a draft render. So if you're if you put a bunch of lights in the scene, or if you set your environment settings and you want to take a look at it, and then after you're done with doing a draft render, you want to play around with the lighting levels to see if you can get it right, you can't. You can play around with some. You can play around with your exposure and brightness and stuff like that and shadows, but not actual lights. Like you can actually turn lights on and off if you have actual light sources in your model. So what you do here is you want to change multi-light onto intensity, and then you'll get these little slider bars that are going to show you how to change it later on. And make sure it's on production. Is that clear? Outside of that, everything else can stay default. What questions do you have? Not too much, right? All right, cool. So next up, we're going to look at assigning materials, and then we'll do a draft render.